Hello Year 12, Lesson 12. We are at the end of our Constitution topic. We have looked at the core principles of the US Constitution. They are separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism. We can recall that the separation of powers is found in Articles 1, 2 and 3, that the US Constitution has a formal amendment procedure in Article 5. We know that there is a supremacy clause putting the Constitution as the most important thing in the US in Article 6, and we know that the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments in the Constitution. We also know that the US Constitution is codified, so it's found in one place, it's all written down, and it is entrenched. Thus everything in the Constitution is protected. Now, we are at the end of the topic, so it's time now to write a 30-mark question. But because we haven't done the Supreme Court yet, there are some questions that I want to stay away from, like, is the US Constitution fit for purpose? Should the US Constitution be more flexible? Because we can't really do that until we've done judges. So we will come back to those. For now, we are going to look at federalism. Now, people often find this the most difficult part in the beginning. They struggle to get their heads around it. But once we've gone through this and once you practice the essay, it should be stuck in your minds forever. And there really is only one type of question that the examiners will ask you, which is federalism working in the US? So please download onto a different device or have a printout of the PowerPoint that I sent you. And it's this PowerPoint that was given to us by Hodder. It was at an A-level revision day. So I'm going to focus on this because it was given to all students as revision. The question that we're going to look at today is, how federal is the USA in reality? So federalism. Two essential features that they tell us that we must focus on. First of all, that the power of regional governments or states is protected by the Constitution. You know that because we find that in Amendment 10, otherwise known as reserved powers. So anything not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution as belonging to Congress or the President is a power for the states. We also know that regional powers all have equal lawmaking powers. So that's not like in the UK where we have devolution and different devolved bodies will have different levels of power. So for example, mayors in Manchester won't have the same degree of power as the Scottish Parliament, and the Northern Irish Assembly hasn't had the same amount of power as the Scottish Parliament. In the US, every single state, every 50 states has the same amount of power. Now, in terms of answering the question requires us to discuss the extent to which the Constitution provides protection for state power. So the extent, so how well does it do it? It's not does it or doesn't it, but how, to what extent? Does it do it in a really, really good way? Or is it slightly struggling? Are there any gaps it needs to fill? And there are 3 points that they suggest that we look at. One, we need to know or have knowledge of state policy. And you know that because you have looked at 6 case studies from pre-TUTE, including marijuana, euthanasia laws, gun laws. We also need to have historical knowledge of federalism, but it does say that we don't need to know a great deal of it. We just need to be aware that federalism is not fixed. It's always changing, and that will depend on which parties are in power, which president is in power, and what's happening nationally. And we also should all be aware that there is a growing increased role for federal government, but we must be careful not to say to the examiner, and that means that states don't have any powers. Because just because federal government's powers increases doesn't mean that states' powers decrease. They could also be increasing powers in other areas too. So let's begin. The first thing they ask us to look at are the things that happened under Trump in terms of federalism. Because we're a contemporary subject, we want to tell the examiner as many sort of up-to-date things as we can. So although we can talk about Obama, we can talk about Bush, we don't really want to be going back too far. We want to make everything as up-to-date as possible. So let's start with Donald Trump. So in terms of how he's dealt with things or his relationship with the states, we know about sanctuary cities. We know that he tried to say to states, if you try to protect illegal immigrants and you don't report them to the federal agency ICE, I will withdraw your funding. Now, he was told by a judge that he couldn't do that. But the point is that he told states that he didn't want that to happen. And it was called coercive federalism. He's coercing them into doing something by saying, if you don't do what I want, I'm not going to give you any money. So that's not a very positive relationship. We also saw Trump reject the Paris Agreement. He was one of the only countries to do that. So he said, I'm going to come out of the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement is where all the countries have agreed to tackle climate change together. He's decided that America does not need to be part of it, that America does not need to waste its money on it, and therefore his plan is to withdraw, and they should have withdrawn completely by the end of 2020. However, some states in the US have recognised the importance of being part of this agreement, and they have decided to get together and stay within this agreement, and they want to continue to tackle climate change. So there we can see states sort of pushing back against Donald Trump. We have also seen transgender laws being changed under Donald Trump. So under Obama, we saw with the bathroom bills, transgender rights being widened, and Obama telling states, what they should be doing. But then we saw Donald Trump returning states back power back to states. So telling states, you decide what you want to do. You don't have to have transgender neutral toilets. It's up to you what you do. So he was giving power back. And then the last point, so states litigating against federal government is a really, really good point for us to say to the examiner, well, the relationship can't be very positive at the moment between federal government and states because the states are litigating. And litigating is when you sue someone, you take a case to court because you're not very happy with them. And under Trump, we've seen a massive increase in cases being brought to the various courts. And you can see this on the next slide. So that's slide 5. It says, number of lawsuits brought by state attorneys generals against the federal government. And when it gets to 2017, it goes whoosh. So it's a massively increased under Donald Trump. February 2018, it says 11 states are suing Trump over the lack of enforcement of Obama-era water rules. Now, Obama decided that climate was very important, that the environment was very important, and he decided also that protecting water supplies was really important. He wanted everybody in America to have a clean water supply. And that meant that not only should people be protecting lakes and rivers, but any kind of water source. So even the littlest stream going across somebody's land should be protected. And he regulated and said to farmers, any kind of stream that goes across your land, you have to make sure it's clean, it's not polluted, because it all goes into the same water supply. As soon as Trump came in, he said, nah, not important, not going to do it. We're not going to waste our time as federal government checking up on people and checking up that they are maintaining a good water system, good water supply, and they're not polluting things. And 11 states were so cross with him because they thought this was his job. They thought that this was federal government's job to actually regulate everything in every state. So they are and still suing him. So slide 6. Does the Trump administration increase or decrease state power? And like all good essays, we've got points on both sides. We have been told that there are these 3 points to tell us that state power is increasing. And let's go through this one at a time. So 1, deregulation. States can choose things like environmental control. So I've just talked about the water era rules. Donald Trump has given power back to the states to decide on things like education and a little bit more on health. He's tried to on health. We'll come back to that. And especially the environment. He doesn't really care. He doesn't see that as federal government's job. There has been a return of power to the states in terms of some moral decisions, like transgender rights. When we talked a few times about abortion, that one's a bit more tricky, and we will come back to that in later lessons when we look at the Supreme Court. But for some things, he's just gone, I just don't care. And it's probably less of a moral decision, more of a he's just not interested. So he's given that power back to states. And finally, with welfare, he also has said to states, it's up to you what you spend your money on. You do not have to increase your Medicaid and your Medicare spending. You do not have to provide any more SNAP assistance. And SNAP assistance is food stamps, whereas Obama did actually try to encourage more and more spending in those areas. In terms of decreasing state powers, he has actually reduced a lot of funding to states. So states do rely on federal government to provide them with lots of funding. They don't necessarily want to be told what to spend it on, but they need the money. And he has reduced spending, and he's especially for welfare programs. Also, we have seen some sort of moral attacks, and we've seen this particularly with the sanctuary cities. So with immigration, we know that Donald Trump was really high up on his agenda. He wants to cut down on immigration. And with the sanctuary cities, he attacked all those states that were protecting people that didn't have the right documents. And that's quite morally conservative. And we would call him a moral conservative in that sense, because he's trying to keep other people out of America. He doesn't want people who are different from Americans. He doesn't want different cultures, different institutions, keeping them out. Morally conservative. So if we turn over. So to what extent can states determine their own affairs is what the next slide says. And that is how we're going to answer this question. How federal is the USA in reality? Now, reality is quite an important word, because we know that in theory there is federalism, or it's implied in the Constitution through Amendment 10. But how does it actually work in reality? And this is where we bring all of our case studies in and we show them off to the examiner. So the table there tells us what we're going to look at, and it breaks it down then. The rest of the slides are broken down into 3 points for and 3 points against federalism working. So if we start with number 1, the US is not federal. Number 1, federal mandates and executive orders. So you're mandated, you're told you have to do something, and executive orders are things that are made by the president. So federal regulations and laws have restricted policy control of states, and we've seen that with previous slides. There's been an ideological direction determined by federal government. So the ideological direction at the moment is very conservative. We have a Republican president, and lots of things coming out of federal government have been more on the sort of right-wing side. Lots of deregulation of things, lots of restriction in welfare. And states have been told over the last 60, 70 years what to do. We've seen an increase in federal government dictating, and the biggest ones that we looked at before were voting rights, where they were told how to actually hold their elections. They were told that they had to spend more on Medicare when Obamacare was introduced, and they were told that they had to desegregate their schools.